In Mississippi, in the year 1813, there was a plantation so admired that visitors traveled days just to walk its gardens. Roses bloomed where nothing should grow, magnolias perfumed the air like a promise, and at the center of this beauty worked an enslaved gardener no one truly noticed. What the master never understood was this: while he believed he owned the land, the houses, and the people upon it, he had already lost control of the most dangerous thing on his estate. Because this gardener was not cultivating flowers, he was cultivating secrets. And once those secrets took root, an empire built on reputation, marriages, and honor began to rot from the inside. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Mississippi in 1813 was a place where silence carried more authority than law, where wealth announced itself through stillness rather than noise, and where the hawthorn plantation stood as a monument to that quiet dominance, stretching outward in carefully measured lines of cotton fields and inward toward a house whose white columns suggested permanence, control, and divine approval. And it was within this carefully staged world that Marcus moved each day without being seen, his presence registered only through the results of his labor, rather than his existence as a man. From sunrise to dusk, he worked the soil with a patience that appeared instinctive, shaping rose beds into flawless geometry, coaxing magnolias into bloom where the land itself resisted, and creating pathways so admired that visiting planters would pause mid-conversation just to admire the symmetry, praising the master's taste, while never once asking the name of the person who made it possible. Marcus had been born on the estate, his earliest memories filled with dirt under his nails and the sound of overseers' boots crushing gravel, and from childhood he learned that beauty was not neutral here, that beauty existed to flatter power and distract from violence, and so he learned to make it perfectly. By the time he reached adulthood, the gardens had become his domain, a rare space where he was permitted near the house, near the women, near conversations not meant for him, because the master believed proximity did not equal threat when the person standing there was owned. Marcus listened as much as he worked, absorbing the rhythms of the household, the long silences between the master and his wife, the performative laughter at dinner parties, the way the daughters moved through rooms as if their bodies were already being negotiated for futures they did not choose. He noticed how often the mistress wandered into the garden alone, lingering near the roses, as though hoping the air itself might answer questions no one else would acknowledge, how the daughters watched him from the upper windows under the pretense of admiring the flowers, and how loneliness, like rot beneath polished wood, spread quietly through the estate. Marcus never mistook this for kindness, never confused access with freedom, but he understood something the master did not, that neglect creates hunger, and hunger makes people careless. The Hawthorne family believed themselves insulated by status, by bloodlines, by the unquestioned hierarchy that governed every interaction on their land, and because of that belief, they failed to notice how often Marcus was present when walls came down, when voices softened, when truths slipped out in half-spoken confessions carried on the humid Mississippi air. He learned the language of pauses, the meaning of glances, the way certain women spoke differently when no one else was listening, and he stored these observations away not as grievances, but as knowledge. The master prided himself on control, on order, on the certainty that nothing within his borders existed beyond his reach, and yet he had unknowingly placed Marcus at the center of his world, close enough to witness every fracture, every fault line hidden beneath polite routines. Marcus never challenged authority openly, never acted out of impulse, because impulse was a luxury he could not afford. Instead, he cultivated patience as deliberately as he cultivated the soil, understanding that time itself could be a weapon when wielded correctly. The gardens became his cover, his justification for being everywhere and nowhere at once. And while the master saw only a useful tool, Marcus saw patterns forming, connections waiting to be made, a structure so rigid that even a small strategic pressure could cause it to collapse inward. He did not yet act, not because he lacked desire, but because he understood that true destruction required intimacy, not violence, and that intimacy, once introduced into a system built on denial, could not be controlled. And so he waited, tending roses that symbolized devotion, magnolias that suggested purity, all while learning the emotional geography of a household that mistook ownership for understanding. This is where the story truly begins, not with scandal or confrontation, but with observation, with a man deemed powerless quietly mapping the weaknesses of an empire that believed itself untouchable. And before we continue into how those weaknesses were exploited and how a gardener became the architect of ruin, take a moment to subscribe to Born into Darkness. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chapter of this descent, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because these stories stretch farther than the plantations that tried to contain them, and what comes next will show you how destruction doesn't always arrive with fire and noise, but sometimes with patience, proximity, and silence. The seasons shifted, and the Mississippi heat grew heavier. Marcus's quiet study of the Hawthorne household deepened into something more deliberate, because knowledge without application was only survival, and he had begun to imagine something beyond surviving, something closer to reclaiming agency in a world designed to strip it away. The first change was subtle, almost invisible even to those who lived alongside him, because Marcus understood that any sudden shift in behavior would draw suspicion, and suspicion was fatal. Instead, he refined what already existed, sharpening his attentiveness, adjusting his presence so that it appeared coincidental rather than intentional, learning precisely when to speak and when silence carried more power than words. The mistress of the house, Eleanor Hawthorne, became the first fault line he fully mapped, not because she was weak, but because she was profoundly alone in ways no one acknowledged. Married young into a union arranged more like a merger than a partnership, Eleanor had spent years performing the role expected of her, hosting dinners, managing the household, producing heirs, all while her husband's affections drifted elsewhere, toward business, toward reputation, toward the unspoken freedoms reserved only for men of his standing. Marcus noticed how her visits to the garden grew longer, how she asked questions about the plants not because she cared about their names, but because conversation itself had become rare currency in her life, and how her voice softened when she spoke to him, not in kindness exactly, but in relief, as though she were momentarily speaking to someone who did not require performance. He responded carefully, never crossing boundaries, offering answers that invited further questions, letting pauses stretch just long enough to allow her to fill them, and in those pauses she began to reveal fragments of herself, complaints disguised as observations, confessions hidden inside comments about the weather or the soil. Marcus did not flatter her directly, because flattery was expected and therefore meaningless. Instead, he listened with a focus that made her feel seen in a way he had not felt in years, and that attention, more than any compliment, began to draw her closer. At the same time, he became more visible to the daughters, not through pursuit, but through consistency, through the quiet confidence with which he worked, through the way the garden responded to him as if it recognized his authority. The eldest daughter, Clara, watched him with curiosity that bordered on fascination. Raised as she had been to believe that mastery over land and people was natural, yet sensing in Marcus a competence that existed outside the hierarchy she had been taught to accept. The younger daughters followed her lead, whispering about him behind fans at summer gatherings, turning him into a figure both forbidden and intriguing, because prohibition itself sharpened interest. Marcus allowed this attention without encouraging it, understanding that desire grows most dangerously when it believes itself self-generated. He never forgot the stakes, never allowed himself to believe that affection would protect him if discovered, and so every interaction was measured, every word weighed against the potential cost. Beyond the immediate family, Marcus observed the wider network that orbited the Hawthornes, the neighboring plantation owners, the business partners, the wives who attended luncheons and picnics with practiced smiles, each one bound by similar constraints, each one living within a system that granted them privilege while denying them autonomy. He noticed patterns repeating across households, marriages defined by convenience, women isolated within grand homes, men absent or indifferent, and it became clear to him that the Hawthorne plantation was not unique, only exemplary. Still, he chose to begin here, because proximity mattered, and because the master's arrogance had placed Marcus in a position of unusual access. The first deliberate step came not as a grand gesture, but as an adjustment in tone, a moment when Marcus responded to Eleanor with a question rather than an answer, gently inviting her to articulate a thought she had only hinted at, and when she did, her voice trembled not with fear, but with the unfamiliar sensation of being heard. From that moment, their conversations deepened incrementally, moving from surface observations to shared reflections on loneliness, on time passing unnoticed, on the strange feeling of living a life that appeared full from the outside while feeling hollow within. Marcus never touched her, never suggested impropriety, because he understood that the mind must cross boundaries before the body dares to follow, and he allowed Eleanor to reach those conclusions herself. Meanwhile, Clara began finding excuses to pass through the garden unaccompanied, asking Marcus about pruning techniques, about soil composition, about anything that would justify lingering, and Marcus responded with the same careful restraint, offering guidance without intimacy, respect without submission, and that balance unsettled her more than boldness ever could have. The household shifted almost imperceptibly as these new dynamics took root, tension coiling beneath the routines, glances exchanged that carried unspoken meanings, silences growing charged rather than empty. Marcus felt the weight of what he was initiating, aware that once these forces were set in motion, they could not be easily contained, and yet he pressed forward, driven not by cruelty, but by a calculated understanding that systems built on exploitation inevitably collapse when confronted with their own contradictions. The master remained oblivious, satisfied with the beauty of his gardens, proud of his household's reputation, blind to the fact that the very order he celebrated had created the conditions for its undoing. Marcus's patience, once a tool for endurance, had become a strategy, and as summer deepened into something heavier and more oppressive, the lines between observation and action began to blur, setting the stage for choices that would bind him irrevocably to the fate of the family he served, and from which there would be no clean escape, only consequences that would ripple far beyond the manicured paths where it all began. As the oppressive Mississippi summer stretched on, thick with heat and the scent of magnolia blossoms, the careful balance Marcus had cultivated began to tilt, not suddenly but with the slow, inevitable pressure of emotions that had been denied expression for too long, and it was in that quiet escalation that his strategy moved from observation into action without ever announcing itself as such. Eleanor Hawthorne's visits to the garden became a daily ritual, no longer disguised as coincidence, but justified as necessity, because she had convinced herself that the roses bloomed better when she was near them, that the garden itself responded to her presence, though in truth it was Marcus's attention she had begun to crave, the steady, thoughtful way he acknowledged her existence without demanding anything in return. Their conversations drifted from reflections on loneliness to memories of youth, to the subtle grief of choices made too early and roles assumed too fully, and Marcus listened with the same intensity he brought to his work, allowing her to speak until the silence between them felt intimate rather than empty. He noticed how her posture softened in his presence, how she removed her gloves when speaking to him, a small rebellion against decorum that felt significant in a life governed by rules, and when she laughed, quietly and with a hand covering her mouth, it carried a freedom she no longer displayed in the house. Marcus never initiated touch, yet proximity itself became charged, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they examined a rosebush, their hands reaching for the same stem and withdrawing at the same moment, and each near contact heightened the awareness that something irreversible was forming between them. At the same time, Clara's interest sharpened into something more deliberate, her youthful curiosity giving way to a fascination shaped by the contradictions Marcus embodied. His intelligence paired with enforced silence, his confidence restrained by circumstance, and she began to seek him out with increasing boldness, arriving in the garden at hours she knew her mother would be absent, asking questions less about plants and more about his life, his thoughts, the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. Marcus answered carefully, revealing just enough to intrigue without exposing vulnerability, speaking of seasons and soil as metaphors for endurance, of patience as a form of strength, and Clara listened with an intensity that unsettled her, because she had never before encountered a man who did not perform for her approval, who neither flattered nor deferred, and that absence of expectation made her feel both invisible and profoundly seen. The younger daughters watched these interactions from a distance, whispering among themselves, their imaginations filling in gaps with speculation, and while Marcus did not engage them directly, he was aware of their gaze, of the way rumors germinate in silence, and he adjusted his behavior accordingly, ensuring that nothing he did could be easily framed as misconduct because plausibility was his shield. Beyond the Hawthorne household, the plantation's social calendar filled with gatherings, dinners, and visits from neighboring families, and Marcus found himself increasingly present at the margins of these events, tending to decorations, arranging flowers, standing close enough to hear fragments of conversation exchanged between women bound by similar lives of confinement and expectation. He learned which marriages were brittle, which women drank more than was proper, which laughed too loudly, which stared too long into the distance when their husbands spoke, and he began to understand that desire, like resentment, accumulates quietly until it seeks release. The first undeniable shift occurred not through a dramatic confession, but through a moment of shared vulnerability when Eleanor, standing among the roses at dusk, admitted in a trembling voice that she felt as though she were disappearing within her own life, that no one truly knew her anymore, and Marcus responded not with reassurance but with recognition, telling her that he saw her, not as a role or a symbol, but as a woman who had been forced to compress herself to fit expectations she did not choose. The words struck her with the force of truth, and in that moment, the distance between them collapsed, not physically but emotionally, and Eleanor reached out, her hand resting briefly on Marcus's arm before she withdrew, startled by her own audacity. Marcus did not react, did not flinch or pursue, allowing her the dignity of agency, and it was that restraint that confirmed to her that what she felt was real, not a fleeting indiscretion but a connection she had long been denied. Clara, sensing a change she could not name, grew restless, her visits becoming more frequent, her questions more personal, and one afternoon, as a summer storm gathered and thunder rolled in the distance, she confessed her confusion, her frustration with a future already planned for her, a marriage arranged, a life mapped without her consent. Marcus listened, recognizing echoes of Eleanor's despair in Clara's youthful words, and though he knew the danger of entanglement, he also understood that desire is not linear, that it does not respect boundaries drawn by logic or caution, and that the very structure of the world they inhabited encouraged secrecy while punishing honesty. As rain began to fall, they took shelter beneath the garden's arbor, the air thick with humidity and unspoken tension, and in that confined space, words gave way to silence heavy with meaning, a silence that acknowledged what neither dared articulate. Marcus felt the weight of his choices pressing in on him, aware that each connection he formed tightened the web he was weaving, a web that could entrap him as easily as it might ensnare those who underestimated him, and yet he pressed forward, driven by a mixture of calculated resolve and a growing belief that the collapse he envisioned was not an act of cruelty, but an exposure of truths long buried beneath politeness and power. The master remained oblivious, proud of the harmony he believed his household embodied, blind to the emotional undercurrents reshaping it from within, and as the storm passed and the garden emerged renewed, glistening under the clearing sky, Marcus understood that the first irreversible lines had been crossed, that the quiet, controlled world he navigated had begun to fracture, and that the consequences, though not yet visible, were already unfolding, binding him, Eleanor, Clara, and the entire Hawthorne legacy to a future that would no longer obey the rules that once seemed immutable. As summer surrendered to an uneasy autumn, the plantation entered a phase that felt outwardly unchanged, yet inwardly unstable, like a grand house whose foundations had begun to crack while its chandeliers still glittered. And Marcus moved through this altered landscape with a heightened awareness that every glance, every pause in conversation, every accidental meeting carried consequences that could no longer be undone. Eleanor's demeanor shifted first, subtle enough to escape notice from those who knew her only in passing, but unmistakable to Marcus, who saw the way her eyes followed him when she believed herself unobserved, the way her voice softened when she addressed him, the way she lingered at the garden's edge even when she had no practical reason to be there. Their connection, once tentative and restrained, deepened through shared silences rather than declarations, through moments where words would have cheapened what they both felt, and Marcus understood that the power of this bond lay not in secrecy alone, but in its emotional authenticity, because Eleanor was no longer seeking escape from boredom but recognition of her suppressed self. It was during one such evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas began their relentless chorus, that Eleanor finally spoke what had hovered between them for weeks, confessing that she feared she had crossed a line from which there was no return, that her thoughts were no longer her own, and that she felt both alive and terrified in equal measure. Marcus responded with a quiet honesty that acknowledged her fear without feeding it, telling her that lines drawn by a cruel system were never meant to protect the soul, only the illusion of order, and that what she felt was neither shameful nor weak, but a response to years of emotional deprivation. The words did not absolve her of guilt, but they reframed it, transforming her internal struggle from a personal failing into a consequence of a life designed to silence her desires, and in that reframing, Eleanor found both comfort and resolve. At the same time, Clara's restlessness evolved into defiance, her once hesitant curiosity sharpening into determination, and she began to test boundaries openly, asking Marcus to meet her beyond the garden, near the stables or along the riverbank, places where the pretense of horticultural instruction could no longer be maintained. Marcus resisted at first, not out of lack of interest, but out of awareness that Clara's youth and impulsiveness made her both a potent catalyst and a dangerous liability. Yet he also recognized that denying her entirely would only intensify her fixation, so he chose a middle path, meeting her in controlled settings, maintaining a tone that balanced intimacy with restraint. These encounters revealed a depth to Clara that surprised him, a keen intelligence dulled by expectation, a longing for agency masked as romantic yearning, and as she spoke of her fears, her resentment toward a mother who embodied everything she was expected to become, Marcus saw how desire and rebellion intertwined, how her attraction to him was as much about resistance as it was about affection. The younger sisters, sensing the tension without understanding its source, began to emulate Clara's behavior, visiting the garden more frequently, asking questions that skirted propriety, and Marcus realized that his presence had become a focal point for the household's unspoken frustrations, a mirror reflecting desires that had no sanctioned outlet. Beyond the plantation, whispers began to circulate, faint at first, carried by servants and guests who noticed the mistress's frequent absences, the daughter's uncharacteristic defiance, the gardener's unusual proximity to the family, and though no accusation was voiced aloud, the atmosphere grew charged with suspicion, a collective awareness that something was amiss beneath the surface of respectability. The master, however, remained resolutely blind, interpreting Eleanor's renewed vitality as a sign of domestic harmony, Clara's assertiveness as youthful spirit, and Marcus's increased responsibilities as evidence of his own benevolence, and it was this blindness that emboldened Marcus, who understood that power often falters not through confrontation but through complacency. The first physical boundary was crossed not in a moment of passion, but in one of exhaustion, when Eleanor, overwhelmed by the strain of maintaining appearances, sought solace in the garden late at night, finding Marcus tending to a dying vine under lantern light. And as she spoke of her fears, her voice breaking under the weight of expectation, she reached for him instinctively, her hand grasping his sleeve as if anchoring herself to something real. Marcus did not pull away, nor did he advance, allowing the moment to exist without escalation, and in that stillness Eleanor leaned into him, her forehead resting briefly against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that transcended desire. The intimacy of that contact, brief yet profound, sealed what words had only suggested, binding them in a shared understanding that could not be retracted. Clara's response to this unspoken shift was immediate and visceral, her jealousy flaring not as rivalry, but as a desperate assertion of her own significance, and she confronted Marcus one afternoon, accusing him of withholding himself, of choosing safety over truth, of underestimating her capacity for secrecy and commitment. Marcus listened, recognizing the danger of her emotional intensity, yet he also saw an opportunity, because Clara's insistence on agency mirrored the very defiance he sought to cultivate within the household, and he began to understand that the collapse he envisioned would not come from a single revelation, but from the accumulation of contradictions, each relationship amplifying the strain on the system that sought to contain them. As autumn deepened, Eleanor and Clara's paths converged in unexpected ways, their interactions growing tense, marked by sharp exchanges and unspoken competition, and Marcus found himself navigating not only their individual desires, but the volatile dynamics between them, aware that the smallest misstep could ignite a confrontation that would expose everything prematurely. Yet he pressed on, guided by a conviction that the facade of harmony was already unsustainable, that the plantation's moral order was a fragile construct maintained through denial, and that by allowing these suppressed truths to surface, he was not destroying something whole but revealing something already broken. The nights grew longer, the air cooler, and with each passing day, the sense of inevitability intensified, as though the plantation itself sensed the approaching reckoning, its once orderly rhythms disrupted by an undercurrent of anticipation, and Marcus, standing at the center of this slow unraveling, understood that the garden he tended was no longer merely a place of beauty, but a crucible in which the Hawthorne family's carefully cultivated image would be tested, reshaped, and ultimately undone, not through force or rebellion, but through the quiet, relentless exposure of desires that refused to remain buried any longer. By the time winter announced itself with sharp mornings and pale skies, the plantation had entered a phase of suspended tension, a season where everything appeared slowed and hushed, while unseen forces continued to grind against one another beneath the surface, and Marcus felt this shift acutely as he moved through the grounds with a deliberate calm that masked the constant calculations in his mind. Eleanor had grown quieter, not distant, but inward, carrying herself with a composed solemnity that fooled nearly everyone except Marcus, who recognized the signs of a woman learning to live with a secret that had transformed her understanding of herself and her marriage, and he watched how she began to question her own routines, altering the order of her days, lingering less in the grand rooms of the house and more in spaces that felt less performative, as though she was subconsciously stepping away from the role she had been trained to play. Their interactions became infrequent but weighted, each meeting carrying the residue of unspoken meaning, a shared awareness that what had begun as emotional recognition had quietly crossed into something irrevocable, even if no explicit vow or declaration had been made. Clara, on the other hand, grew increasingly bold, her defiance no longer confined to private moments but spilling into her public demeanor, where she challenged her father's expectations, questioned her mother's authority with thinly veiled sarcasm, and displayed a restlessness that unsettled the household. And Marcus understood that her rebellion was fueled not only by desire but by the intoxicating realization that she could disrupt the order she despised. He saw how she used her attraction to him as a form of leverage against the constraints imposed upon her, testing how far she could push without provoking consequences, and while he remained cautious, he did not retreat entirely, recognizing that Clara's impatience, though dangerous, was also a necessary accelerant in the larger unraveling he envisioned. The master's business associates began visiting more frequently, men whose fortunes were intertwined with the plantation's success, and their presence added a layer of scrutiny that heightened the risk of exposure. As servants whispered, eyes lingered, and patterns were noticed, and Marcus became acutely aware that his visibility, once a shield, was now a liability. He adapted by shifting his movements, delegating tasks, and cultivating the impression of tireless devotion to his work, allowing rumors of his excellence to drown out suspicions of impropriety, because in a society obsessed with productivity and hierarchy, usefulness often eclipsed morality. Eleanor's internal struggle reached a turning point one evening when she confided in Marcus, not with confession, but with resolve. Admitting that she could no longer ignore the emptiness of her marriage, nor pretend that her life was untouched by the injustices she had long accepted as inevitable. And Marcus listened as she spoke of guilt that was less about betrayal of her husband and more about betrayal of herself, of the years she had spent silencing her instincts in service of appearances. He did not offer absolution, knowing that such comfort would ring hollow, but instead acknowledged her pain as valid and her awakening as costly, reminding her that awareness often arrives not as liberation, but as a burden that demands action. And in that moment, Eleanor began to see her connection to Marcus not merely as an illicit attachment, but as a catalyst that forced her to confront the moral rot underlying her privilege. Clara's confrontation came shortly thereafter, explosive and emotional, as she accused Marcus of favoring her mother, of hiding behind restraint to avoid choosing, and Marcus responded with a rare firmness that cut through her anger, telling her that desire without consequence was a fantasy sold to women to keep them distracted, and that true agency required patience and awareness, words that stung but also resonated, because Clara recognized in his tone a refusal to indulge her illusions. This confrontation marked a subtle shift in their dynamic, as Clara began to observe rather than demand, to listen rather than insist, and Marcus saw her transformation as both a relief and a warning, because reflection often preceded decisive action. Meanwhile, the younger daughters, sensing the emotional currents but lacking the context to interpret them, gravitated toward Marcus as a confidant, asking questions about the world beyond the plantation, about cities, about people who lived without inherited expectations, and he answered carefully, planting seeds of curiosity that challenged their insular worldview without exposing them to immediate danger. The plantation itself seemed to mirror the household's instability, as storms damaged fences, crops suffered from unexpected blight, and minor accidents disrupted daily routines, events that were dismissed as misfortune but which Marcus recognized as symbols of a system under strain, its reliance on control undermined by variables it could not dominate. The master's frustration grew, manifesting in sharper commands and harsher discipline toward those he deemed expendable, and Marcus observed this escalation with grim satisfaction, understanding that tyranny often intensifies when authority senses its erosion. Eleanor's husband remained oblivious to the true source of his wife's withdrawal, attributing her seriousness to seasonal melancholy or domestic concerns, and his ignorance emboldened Eleanor, who began quietly asserting herself in matters she had previously deferred, questioning financial decisions, advocating for changes in household management, actions that unsettled him but did not yet provoke confrontation. Marcus recognized these shifts as signs that the collapse he envisioned was no longer hypothetical, but unfolding in incremental, irreversible ways, as each person's internal conflict manifested outwardly, disrupting the illusion of harmony that had sustained the plantation's social order. Winter deepened, bringing long nights that forced reflection, and Marcus used this time to consolidate his influence, strengthening his relationships with those who moved unseen through the household, sharing knowledge, exchanging favors, and building a network of quiet loyalty that transcended fear, because he understood that when the reckoning came, survival would depend not on individual cunning, but collective awareness. Eleanor's awakening extended beyond her relationship with Marcus, as she began questioning the institution that had shaped her life, recognizing the violence masked by civility, and though she did not voice these thoughts publicly, her altered behavior spoke volumes, creating ripples that reached even those who benefited from her former compliance. Clara's maturation continued, her defiance evolving into strategic observation as she learned to read people's weaknesses, to navigate conversations with calculated ambiguity. And Marcus saw in her a reflection of his own journey, a mind sharpening against constraint. As winter neared its end, the plantation stood at a precarious threshold, its inhabitants bound together by secrets, desires, and unspoken truths that could no longer coexist peacefully. And Marcus, standing in the garden that had become both sanctuary and battlefield, understood that the next phase would demand more than subtlety, that the slow burn of exposure was approaching a point where restraint would give way to revelation, and as the cold winds carried the promise of spring, they also carried the certainty that the fragile equilibrium sustaining the master's empire was nearing its breaking point, poised to collapse under the weight of truths that had been nurtured, not by force, but by the quiet insistence of human longing and the inexorable demand for agency. As spring finally broke through the last grip of winter, the plantation entered a season that should have symbolized renewal, yet instead it felt like a slow, inevitable exposure, as if the land itself were preparing to reveal what had been buried too long, and Marcus sensed this with every step he took across the grounds, where the soil was freshly turned and deceptively calm. The master, emboldened by the promise of a profitable year, began hosting more elaborate gatherings, inviting neighbors, merchants, and distant relatives to admire his estate, and with each event, the delicate web of secrets tightened, because increased visibility meant increased risk, and Marcus understood that the stage was being set not by him alone, but by the arrogance of power that believed itself untouchable. Eleanor moved through these gatherings with a practiced grace that masked her growing detachment, her smiles precise, her words measured, yet beneath that composure was a woman quietly preparing for a reckoning she could no longer avoid. As she began redirecting household funds, questioning contracts and delaying decisions under the guise of prudence, actions that subtly undermined her husband's authority while appearing entirely reasonable to those observing from the outside. Clara, now acutely aware of how perception could be manipulated, assisted her mother with calculated enthusiasm, presenting herself as dutiful and reformed, a performance so convincing that it disarmed suspicion, even as she used these public roles to gather information, listening carefully to the conversations of men who underestimated her intelligence and women who assumed her compliance, and Marcus watched this evolution with both admiration and caution, knowing that empowerment came with consequences that could not be predicted. The younger daughters, influenced by TV's shifting atmosphere, grew bolder in their curiosity, questioning traditions they had once accepted without thought, and Marcus answered them with stories framed as observations rather than lessons, encouraging them to see the world as constructed rather than ordained, a subtle but radical shift that planted doubt where obedience had once reigned. Meanwhile, among the enslaved community, whispers circulated more freely than before, not of rebellion in the overt sense, but of awareness, of watching closely, of understanding that the cracks forming within the household were opportunities to be navigated carefully, and Marcus worked tirelessly to ensure that this awareness did not become recklessness, reminding those who trusted him that survival depended on patience and collective restraint. The master's temper worsened as his control slipped in ways he could not name, manifesting in erratic decisions and harsh discipline that alienated even his allies, and his business partners began to notice inconsistencies in his accounts, delays in shipments, and an uncharacteristic defensiveness that raised quiet concerns about his reliability. Eleanor's influence, once confined to domestic matters, began seeping into these external relationships as she leveraged her social standing to smooth tensions while subtly redirecting loyalty away from her husband, and Marcus recognized that her actions, though cautious, were eroding the foundation of authority more effectively than any overt challenge could. A pivotal moment came during a grand spring celebration meant to showcase the plantation's prosperity, when a minor but visible mishap, a collapsed trellis, poorly secured by a hastily supervised crew, sparked a public outburst from the master that revealed his instability to a room full of influential witnesses, and Marcus noted how the crowd's polite discomfort shifted into something closer to doubt as murmurs followed the incident, questions unspoken but unmistakable. Clara, witnessing this fracture, understood that the man who ruled her life was no longer infallible, and she began pressing her mother to prepare for contingencies, urging her to consider what would happen if the structure they lived within failed entirely, conversations that Eleanor resisted at first but eventually entertained, recognizing that denial would only leave them unprotected. Marcus's own role became increasingly precarious as his visibility at the center of so many dynamics made him both indispensable and suspect, and he responded by retreating strategically, allowing others to step forward, empowering those he trusted to carry responsibilities that had once been his alone, because he understood that influence dispersed was harder to destroy than influence concentrated. The garden, once a place of quiet manipulation, became a site of reflection, where Marcus measured the cost of what he had set in motion, aware that the collapse he sought would not spare those caught within it, and this awareness weighed heavily on him, even as he reaffirmed that inaction would only perpetuate a system built on suffering. Eleanor's transformation reached a decisive point when she confronted her husband privately, not with accusations but with a declaration of autonomy, informing him that she would no longer serve as a silent partner in decisions that affected lives she had been taught to ignore, and while he dismissed her words as temporary defiance, the seed of doubt had been planted, destabilizing his sense of dominance in ways he could not immediately counter. Clara, emboldened by her mother's stance, began openly challenging expectations placed upon her future, refusing suitors with calm confidence, framing her refusals as matters of personal incompatibility rather than rebellion, and this subtlety frustrated her father more than open defiance ever could. Among the enslaved, Marcus's guidance began yielding tangible results as networks of mutual support strengthened. Information flowed more efficiently, and small acts of resistance, delayed compliance, strategic errors, feigned ignorance, accumulated into disruptions that compounded the plantation's growing inefficiencies. The master, sensing his empire faltering, sought to reassert control through displays of authority that rang increasingly hollow, and each attempt only exposed his desperation, further weakening his standing among peers who valued stability above all else. As spring gave way to early summer, the plantation stood on the edge of transformation, its outward appearance still impressive, its inner workings frayed beyond repair, and Marcus knew that the next phase would not be about subtle influence but survival, as truths long contained prepared to surface in ways that could not be managed or undone. Standing beneath the blooming magnolias, their fragrance heavy in the air, Marcus felt the weight of inevitability settle over him, understanding that the unraveling he had nurtured was entering a stage where consequences would fall unevenly and unpredictably. And yet, despite the uncertainty, he remained resolute, because the slow destruction of the master's empire was no longer merely an act of revenge or strategy, but a necessary rupture in a system that could not be reformed from within. And as the days lengthened and tensions sharpened, every step forward carried the certainty that the story was approaching its most dangerous and defining chapter. By the height of summer, when the heat pressed down on the plantation like a physical weight and even the nights offered little relief, the fragile structure holding everything together finally began to creak audibly, and Marcus felt it in the way conversations stopped when certain people entered a room, in the way glances lingered just a fraction too long, in the way authority now had to announce itself loudly because it was no longer assumed. The master, increasingly isolated within his own household, mistook noise for power and volume for control, issuing sweeping orders that contradicted one another, reversing decisions days after making them, and in doing so revealed to everyone, family, guests, and enslaved alike, that his certainty had eroded. Eleanor watched this decline with a mixture of fear and resolve, fully aware that her husband's unraveling would not occur quietly, and she began discreetly safeguarding what little autonomy she could claim, moving personal valuables, memorizing account details, and cultivating relationships outside the plantation that might one day offer refuge or leverage. Her interactions with Marcus became less emotional and more strategic, their conversations focused on contingencies rather than confession, on timing rather than desire, because both understood that sentimentality at this stage would be fatal. Clara, now fully awakened to the mechanics of power, grew sharper and colder in her observations, her youthful romanticism replaced by an unsettling clarity as she began to see how quickly admiration turned to contempt when control was threatened, and she used this insight to manipulate social situations with quiet precision, praising her father publicly while undermining him privately, sowing contradictions that confused allies and emboldened skeptics. The younger daughters sensed the danger even if they could not name it, clinging to routines that no longer offered comfort, and Marcus found himself answering their questions with greater care, knowing that innocence was becoming a liability in a household where truth had begun to surface in fragments. Among the enslaved community, the atmosphere shifted from cautious patience to alert readiness, as Marcus's long-standing emphasis on awareness now bore fruit in the form of quiet coordination, people knowing where to be and when not to be seen, information moving swiftly but discreetly, because everyone understood that the coming rupture would create chaos in which only the prepared would endure. The Master's business partners, once content to overlook his excesses in exchange for profit, began withdrawing subtly, delaying investments, declining invitations, and sending representatives instead of appearing personally, and these absences were noted by all, feeding rumors that the plantation's dominance was waning. A critical moment arrived during a midsummer gathering intended to reaffirm alliances, when a heated argument erupted between the master and a longtime associate over a failed shipment, their voices carrying across the veranda, and the associate's departure, abrupt and public, marked a turning point that could not be ignored, as it signaled to observers that loyalty was no longer guaranteed. Eleanor, witnessing this, felt a strange clarity settle over her, realizing that the collapse she had feared was no longer hypothetical but actively unfolding, and she resolved to protect her children from the fallout, even if it meant severing ties she had once believed immutable. Marcus, observing from the periphery, recognized that his role was shifting once again, from instigator to stabilizer, as the risk of uncontrolled violence grew, and he focused his efforts on preventing panic among those who depended on him, reminding them that chaos favored those who acted rashly and punished those who remained visible. The master's paranoia intensified, his suspicion turning inward as he questioned servants, monitored movements, and imposed curfews that disrupted operations rather than securing them, and each attempt to tighten his grip only accelerated the loss of trust that had once sustained his authority. Clara confronted her father openly for the first time during this period, not with defiance but with unsettling composure, questioning his decisions in front of others and framing her concerns as practical rather than emotional, and the discomfort this caused him was evident as he struggled to reconcile the image of the obedient daughter with the reality of a woman who no longer feared his disapproval. Eleanor's private confrontation soon followed, more direct than before, as she challenged him on financial mismanagement and moral hypocrisy, and though he attempted to dismiss her, the presence of witnesses forced him into a defensive posture that further eroded his standing. Marcus understood that these confrontations, though risky, were necessary fractures, because silence had long been the master's greatest ally, and once broken, it could not be restored. The plantation itself seemed to rebel against order, as equipment failed, workers fell ill, and schedules collapsed under the strain of mismanagement, and these tangible disruptions lent credibility to whispers of decline that spread beyond the property's boundaries. As tensions escalated, Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his plan, whether to push further and risk exposure or to step back and allow the system to implode under its own weight, and he chose the latter, recognizing that the most effective destruction often came not from decisive blows but from the withdrawal of support. He reduced his visibility further, allowing others to take responsibility for failures that were not theirs, knowing that blame would fall upward as questions multiplied. Eleanor, sensing his retreat, understood it not as abandonment but as necessity, and she prepared herself for a future in which Marcus might no longer be present, a realization that carried both grief and acceptance. The final weeks of summer were marked by a brittle stillness, the kind that precedes a storm, and every interaction felt charged with unspoken anticipation, as if all involved were waiting for an inevitable reckoning without knowing its form. Marcus, standing once more in the garden that had been the quiet center of so many transformations, reflected on the cost of what he had set in motion, aware that the destruction of the master's empire would not restore what had been taken from him or others, but carve a space where something different could exist, however fragile. As the season began to turn and the first hints of autumn cooled the air, he knew that the next phase would not belong to planners or manipulators, but to those who could endure uncertainty without losing themselves, and with that understanding, he prepared to face whatever consequences awaited. Because the unraveling was no longer a question of if, but when, and the final act of this long deliberate collapse was already unfolding, carried forward by truths that had finally learned how to speak aloud. As autumn settled fully over the plantation, cooling the air and sharpening every sound, the reckoning arrived not as a single dramatic explosion, but as a drawn-out collapse that unfolded over weeks, each day stripping away another illusion until nothing recognizable remained, and Marcus understood that this was how empires truly ended, not with fire, but with exposure, fatigue, and the slow withdrawal of belief. The master's authority finally fractured beyond repair when a formal inquiry was initiated by one of his former partners, ostensibly over missing funds and breached contracts. But everyone understood that the investigation was less about money and more about trust, or rather, the absence of it, and the arrival of outsiders with ledgers and questions transformed the plantation from a symbol of dominance into a site of scrutiny. Eleanor moved through these days with a composure that surprised even herself, no longer attempting to preserve appearances, but focusing instead on shielding her children from the worst of the fallout, directing them away from public spaces, controlling what they heard, and quietly preparing for a future that no longer revolved around her husband's name. Clara, standing beside her mother, felt the final severing of childhood illusions, watching men who once bowed to her father now speak to him with thinly veiled contempt, and she recognized with chilling clarity how conditional power had always been, how quickly reverence evaporated when usefulness faded. The master reacted as Marcus had anticipated, alternating between denial and rage, blaming servants, weather, rivals, even fate itself, but never confronting the truth that his empire had depended on silence, fear, and compliance, and once those pillars weakened, nothing remained to hold it upright. Marcus remained deliberately distant during this phase, present enough to be useful but absent enough to avoid becoming a focal point, understanding that survival now depended on invisibility rather than influence, and he watched as the systems he had quietly destabilized finally devoured themselves without further intervention. Among the enslaved, the inquiry created a rare and dangerous liminal space, where oversight temporarily replaced cruelty, where movements were monitored by unfamiliar eyes rather than familiar fists, and Marcus used this moment to reinforce caution, reminding everyone that freedom was not imminent simply because power had stumbled, and that missteps now could be fatal once order attempted to reassert itself. Eleanor's husband, facing public humiliation and financial ruin, retreated inward, his bluster dissolving into paranoia and despair, and when he attempted one last assertion of dominance, an impulsive punishment meant to remind everyone who still ruled, it backfired spectacularly, drawing condemnation from the very officials scrutinizing him, and that moment marked the irreversible end of his reign. The plantation's accounts were seized, its operations suspended, and its future placed under external control, a bureaucratic conclusion that lacked drama but carried devastating finality, and as wagons arrived to inventory property, human and otherwise, the weight of what had been built on exploitation became impossible to ignore. Eleanor, witnessing this dismantling, felt neither triumph nor relief, only a profound exhaustion, tempered by the knowledge that the structure which had confined her was gone, even if what replaced it remained uncertain. Clara, standing at the edge of the garden one evening as leaves fell silently around her, understood that she would never again be who she had been before, and she did not mourn that loss, because clarity, once gained, could not be surrendered. Marcus prepared quietly for his own departure from the plantation, knowing that his usefulness would soon expire and that staying would invite scrutiny he could not survive, and in his final interactions with those he had guided, he offered no grand speeches, only reminders to observe, to adapt, and to remember that awareness itself was a form of resistance. His last meeting with Eleanor was brief and wordless, a shared acknowledgement of what had been and what could never be again, and though neither spoke of the future, both understood that their paths were diverging permanently, shaped by the same rupture but leading in different directions. As Marcus walked away from the grounds that had been both prison and proving ground, he did not look back, because the empire he had helped unravel no longer existed as something singular, only as fragments scattered among those who would carry its lessons forward. The plantation, stripped of its myth, became just land again, marked by the memories of those who had endured it, and while no justice could undo the suffering it had produced, its fall stood as quiet evidence that even the most entrenched systems were vulnerable to erosion from within. And now, as this story reaches its end, remember this: history does not only belong to conquerors and masters, but also to those who learned to survive, to observe, and to dismantle power using the few tools they were allowed. If this story held you, unsettled you, or made you see the past differently, take a moment to subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you. Because these are the stories history tried to bury, and together we make sure they are never silent again.